unattainable for millions, especially those in the Horn of Africa. About 7 million livestock in Ethiopia, Kenya, and Somalia have died since last fall. In Somalia alone, 29% of children are are experiencing acute malnutrition. This, combined with supply chain issues and rapidly changing climate, are threatening to make food insecurity worse here at home as well. Food prices are expected to raise 7.5% this year, stretching already tight family budgets. In my home state of Minnesota, dozens of hunger relief organizations are warning of the hungriest summer on record if the state does not convene an emergency session to combat hunger. At the beginning of the pandemic, I passed the Meals Act to let districts provide universal school meals in the hope of staving off the hunger crisis. And it worked. About 30 million kids are now estimated to have received school meals. But that is expiring at the end of the month. Let me be clear. We cannot let these waivers lapse. We must ensure that our children continue to be fed. But we can't stop there. Internationally, while the United States has provided $2.6 billion to help other countries with food shortage, other countries have not stepped up yet. In many conflicts around the world, hunger is being used as a weapon of war. We've seen it in Yemen, we've seen it in Ethiopia, and now we're seeing it in Ukraine. When I spoke to President Biden in April, I urged the administration to prioritize this. Thankfully, they have, announcing hundreds of millions of dollars in global food aid and including billions for food in the Ukraine aid package. But we need to be using all the tools at our disposal to prevent this. We must rally all world leaders to increase supply of food and fertilizers, basic safety nets for those without food, and fund humanitarian operations to reduce famine and hunger. When I was a child living in war-engulfed Somalia and living in a refugee camp, I distinctively remember the vacant feeling of going to bed on an empty stomach when my family didn't have enough food to feed us. I remember the weakness, the inability to concentrate, and the desperation for it to end. I recently heard from Will, a high school student in my Minneapolis district, who faces similar challenges in a very different context. The pandemic exasperated already tight family finances. As a result, he often goes to school without breakfast and finds it difficult to concentrate. When I'm in class, my lunch isn't until 1 p.m., he told me. I'll just be sitting there like, oh my gosh, when is lunch going to come? Because I haven't eaten all day. No child should go through this. We here in the United States must lead to stop this global catastrophe. Now we will hear from a great champion on this issue, Congressman Jamal Bowman.
Thank you. Thank you, Congresswoman Omar, for your leadership on this issue. Thank you for inviting me to be here today. Thank you to my brothers for joining us and speaking out on this issue and continuing to fight with
Got
us.
another sister?
Steve is in the building. Thank you for being here. Um, I've been very privileged throughout my life in which I've never had to go to bed hungry. But I've worked in education for 20 years prior to coming to Congress. And I had children in my classroom and in my school that were constantly hungry. And this is within a school system that provided free breakfast, free lunch, and free supper for after school programs. But it often wasn't enough. It often wasn't enough for them. It often wasn't enough for their siblings, and it often wasn't enough for their families. Because poverty in this country continues to be a persistent issue, and we have more than 20% of our kids going to bed hungry every day. But this is a global issue. It's a worldwide issue. And to have 49 million children suffering from famine or malnutrition it's inhumane, and it's a representation of how savage the human race can be toward itself and towards others. When we have the climate catastrophe that we're dealing with right now, as we have war in countries all over the world, as Congresswoman Omar mentioned, it's time for leading nations to step up and lead from the perspective of human rights before everything else, and lead first and foremost by centering our most vulnerable among us, which are our children. If we are a nation that doesn't take care of our children, what kind of society or democracy do we really have? If there are nations all over the world that are not able to take care of their children, and we do not do everything we can to help them, and if other developed nations do not do everything they can to help them, what kind of world are we actually living in? I believe this is the moment for us to evolve as a human race and do everything we can to fight issues like climate change, to stop the forever conflicts and the wars that are taking place, and put our heads and minds and hearts together to make sure every single child is nourished and fed and put on a pathway to thrive and be healthy and happy, joyous individuals. So I'm really honored and thankful to be here. This is the issue that should be on the front page of every newspaper in this country and around the world, because if we're not taking care of our children, we're failing as a human race. Thank you again, Congressman.
We'll now hear from Representative Julie Garcia.
Good afternoon, friends, and thank you, Congresswoman Omar, for organizing this press conference and for shedding light on how we need to combat and prevent hunger. Governments like ours need to act, and institutions, global institutions, need to act accordingly. The pandemic exposed already unacceptable rates of hunger across the world, and it's only getting worse because of the crises that the Congresswoman discussed. Back home, families in my district struggled to put food on the table when the pandemic hit. Kids in Chicago public schools relied on a critical lifeline throughout the pandemic: school meals. For many kids in my district, school meals may be the only source of food, which is why it is so important for the federal government to step in and give schools some flexibility to make sure that all children are fed. In fact, these waivers allowed schools for the first time to serve free meals to all students across the country, regardless of income. That was a good thing. So think about that. Kids were fed at no charge for 2 years. We can and we should continue doing the same thing. But unfortunately, Republicans said no more and decided that they prefer to let our kids go hungry with these waivers set to expire at the end of this month. No child should have to go hungry. It's as simple as that. We must get these waivers extended now, and so that millions of children across the country don't worry about their next meal. It's a small step, but the impact is far-reaching. Thank you.
And now we'll hear from Tony Carter from Louisiana. Troy Carter.
Thank you, Congressman, for your incredible leadership in this area, and to my colleagues, present and those who aren't. I thank you all because this is a collective effort led by our incredible leader, Representative Omar. It is a somber thing to be here today with my colleagues to bring attention to the serious issue, current and growing global and domestic food crisis. 13 million children already face hunger in the U.S. before the pandemic. But now, global disruptions, especially Putin's unprovoked and unacceptable attack on Ukraine, is making that situation far worse. Food prices are expected to increase by 7.5% this year, stretching already tight budgets. In Louisiana, my home district, 1 of 4 children face hunger. This is unacceptable. In many ways, this is a slow motion disaster unfolding before our very eyes. While this is devastating, it also means that we have an opportunity to take action and do something to help Americans and help people around the world fight hunger. I'm proud to be a co-sponsor of Congresswoman Omar's Meals Act, a great bill to help feed our children healthy foods during and after the pandemic. We also must reinstate the expanded child tax credit, a program for the American Rescue Plan that helps families put food on the table during COVID last year, and the numbers showed how much it helped and that it in fact slashed child poverty in half. In my district in Louisiana, this expanded credit gave $229 million to 86,000 families. This is real. This is not just talk. These are actions that were taken because we fought for them. And now we must compel our colleagues on the other side to recognize that hunger knows no party. Hunger knows no race. Hunger knows no geography. We're America. And we can do better. And we must do better. When you look at not just the bare minimum, the minimal standard of nutrition, of getting food into people's systems, but then we talk about getting healthy food into their systems. We talk about you can go to McDonald's and buy a hamburger for 99 cents, but a salad will cost you 8. It's not cheap to eat well, but it's preventive. Because if you provide our children with good nutrition, we have preventive measures to keep them healthy. We also have them productive in the classroom. We also knew through empirical data that many of our young people are subject to intolerance because of dairy products. Yet in our school systems, we only offer milk, no soy alternatives. So many of our young people are forced to drink milk, not realizing what it was doing to their systems. And they go back to the classroom with their tummies upset, and they can't concentrate, and they can't perform. We're America. We must do better. We must stand up and provide for our young people so they can give us back what we need and want from them, a successful, healthy society. I'll end as I started, thanking Congresswoman Omar for being the leader and stepping up in such a way to galvanize us to work for this issue, but also to send a message to all who are listening, all who will read, all who will learn. We can and must do better to take care of our children, to take care of our communities, and to recognize that there should never be the word America associated with hunger. Ever. Thank you.
Thank you, Troy. Now we will hear from Julie Stevenson.
Congresswoman Omar called and said she was having a press conference on food insecurity and her legislation to help combat it. There is nowhere I would rather be. Now it's starting to rain. It doesn't matter. We've got to feed the children of America. I represent a suburban district in Michigan, and everywhere I go, parents are asking me, what about free and reduced lunch? The first visit I made coming out of the 2020 shutdown was to a school where the food service workers spent the shutdown preparing food, feeding families, thanklessly. They didn't get here okay. They risked everything and they continued to prepare the meals. And it was the most rewarding thing I have ever seen that took place in Waterford, Michigan at our Waterford school system. The time is now to act. The time is now to pass the Lower Food and Fuel Cost Act. My father was an elementary school teacher for many, many years in Detroit. He did Thanksgiving. He did Thanksgiving every week to fill that extra meal for students who needed it and to also teach them how to cook. In March, I sent a letter to the House and Senate leadership urging them to extend COVID-era school nutrition waiver flexibilities to ensure that our most vulnerable kids are getting enough to eat. It is an honor to stand here with my colleagues and to be with all of you, but I sincerely want you to hear what the people of Michigan are telling me as they send me to Washington. Act now. According to the USDA, around 30 million students are now receiving free meals at school, up from 20 million. We've heard this. Who are these families? Who are these children? These are our friends and our neighbors. So failing to act is failing to serve those who are requiring and demanding and needing us most. The House is going to gather this week to pass the legislation that I just referenced to tackle those inflationary pressures. Subject from a just horrible war that has come down from Russia into Ukraine, attacking our food supplies. It's what keeps me up at night. Food costs are through the roof. Feeding a family of 4 or 5, being worth an annual salary for a family, that's not acceptable. So we're coming here today, 1, to call this out, and 2, saying we're not afraid to legislate. We're not afraid to use the power of the United States House of Representatives to make sure that every child is fed and that no child goes hungry. So thank you again, Congressman Omar, for bringing us here today. We're going to get this done. It doesn't matter how hard it rains, because we're working.
Thank you, Haley. Haley is right. When I introduced the Meals Act to create COVID-era waivers, it was because we were hearing so much from families across this country, from educators, from our district, saying we need to figure out some flexibility to continue to feed these children who rely on school meals. And now that legislation and the waivers it created is lapsing. And I have confidence that the Senate will reach an agreement and that we will be able to extend that before it expires at the end of this month. But what we are talking about right now is the nexus of inflation, the climate crisis, and the war in Ukraine that has caused this catastrophe of world food shortage. And some countries that were already struggling, when you think about what's happening in Sudan, in Egypt, in Lebanon, in Sri Lanka, and you think about the Horn of Africa, countries like Ethiopia, Kenya, and Somalia that are dealing with devastating drought and the risk of millions of people going through famine. We have to not only act here locally to make sure that we are feeding the bellies of our children before we can feed their brains, but that we are also being concerned citizens of this world and caring for those who are most vulnerable. When you think about 7% increase in food prices, that is a huge impact on people who are already struggling to afford food. When you think about the 15 to 20% food production loss India has gone through because of droughts, that has a huge impact on the world food supply. And so we have the resources, we know what the solutions are, and it is time for us to act. With that, I know it's raining hard. And we're in the middle of committee, Haley and I, so I'll take 1 or 2 quick questions.
Congresswoman, I was just going to ask you about the economists who say that the increased government spending, especially during the pandemic. The large federal budget has fueled inflation, which has caused the high food prices. Do you support reducing